He was kind of one of the first black, international celebrities, and because he was known for doing this as a minstrel, as a black minstrel performer, and thinking about kind of how the way that he preferred to present himself in public, but the way that he was most lauded, kind of had these kind of two different ways of being framed. And then thinking about recent history, so 20 years ago, I have a lot of my work is really trying to investigate the kind of construction of especially the black male identity. And most of my life growing up, this was kind of the standard as far as you look at the way you looked at white men and black men in America, that you saw that black men would be maybe the champions of the physical realm, and white men would be the champions of kind of intellectual realm and power. And what's interesting about the present moment is this: in this 20 years, there's been this major shift where you finally get the black hope and the great white hope at the same time, and no one really seems to notice. But I'm really interested how future generations will be affected by these shifts. But and you guys probably were around when this ad was out. Do you guys recognize this as an ad? No. Well, anybody know what it's an ad for? Reebok. And how can you tell? The logo. Isn't that weird? That to some degree, I'm fascinated how I can digress. But this is a Reebok ad where there's no Reebok product in the ad, which is pretty curious. So what's really for sale is the question that comes up. And it's 50 Cent, and he says, "I am what I am," and I guess who he really is a criminal. And then you see Andy Ruddock. These are like the first 5 that came out. He is what he is, and he's a champion. And then you have Lucy Liu, and she's just like a cute little girl. And then you have Yao Ming, and he's a monkey on a basketball. And then you have Allen Iverson, and he's the devil. And then you have Jay-Z, and he says, "I got my MBA at Marcy Projects." He's talking about, him being a drug dealer, and that's what the rubber bands are supposed to represent. And what I'm fascinated with is I think about advertising as a form of social conditioning, or as brainwashing, really, and that we think they're so benign, but how do images like this affect the way that we see ourselves and also relate to others? When you see them everywhere all the time in different iterations. And so, so you have one black man, 2006 or 5, whenever this is, and he's a criminal, and you have the one white man, and he's a champion, and then you have the Asian American woman, and she's just like a cute little girl, and then you have the Asian immigrant who we clearly don't know what to do with, and then you have the other black man who's the devil, and the other one is a drug dealer, and how does this affect the world, and imagery and popular culture? And I came across this ad. Someone gave it to me in 2001. They said, "You should do something with this," and I was like, "I don't know what to do with this." And all I could think to do after really 5 years, because of looking at it, I realized that truth was better than fiction, and maybe the only thing that I could do was to remove the logo, and the last thing that you'd think this was an ad for was Japanese cars. And so I started to look at other images and removing the logos, and started to realize kind of how it could really, if we weren't already culturally literate through media literate, we wouldn't know that this is Altoids ad. It could be an ad for anything. And so I started to look at old ads, and this is an ad from 1969. It's actually an ad for pants, and it said "Slack Power, the anti-establishment post-grad slacks by his." And this is fascinating, because it shows how as early as 1969 they figured out how to kind of appropriate the power of the black power movement to sell basically golf pants to revolutionaries. And so I started this project, and it's called Unbranded: Reflections in Black by Corporate America from 1968 to 2008. And I took 2 ads for every year and removed the advertising information, because I feel like you could really see what's being sold. And it's a way of kind of tracking blackness as a kind of corporate idea over the past 40 years. And I chose 1968 because it was a symbolic end of the civil rights movement when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed. And I just picked 2008 randomly, but it happened to be the year that we elected Barack Obama. And so it wound up being bookending these kind of two major events with this kind of development of this black middle class. And you look at the ways that some of the, especially black athletes, are looked at. This is Joe Frazier, and I was fascinated with with this one because when I saw it, it says, "You think you can get me to eat my flapjacks without my blue bonnet? Try it." But when you remove the branding information, you start to see all these other references that blue bonnet is margarine, by the way, but that I see Aunt Jemima, I see references to Hattie McDaniel and the slave mammy caricature, and to take like the heavyweight boxing champion and redepict him in this light, I thought was really kind of suspicious, to say the least. And I chose two ads for every year as a way to kind of keep myself objective in a way. And like this was an ad that I thought was pretty interesting because, like, again, some people here know, but you would never guess what this is an ad for. It's actually an ad for kitty litter, and there's a whole lot that you have to go through to figure out how this could be an ad for kitty litter. And I found this in Ebony magazine, and so maybe it was in Time or something else, but I found it in Ebony. And somebody was in the board. I suspect that someone was in the boardroom. They were like, how do we get black people to buy our kitty litter? Well, black people like watermelon. And what would make watermelon more civilized if all the seeds were in one place and you could just scoop them away, just like our kitty litter? That's the only real logic that there is. And you wonder, maybe it was a black person and they were a room full of white people like, I like watermelon. And they're like, okay, well, in that case, it's not racist if he likes it, But you really wonder how kind of these things shift, because in these earlier ads, most people who were making these ads were white men on Madison Avenue, and you really wonder like how white men's ideas of black identity kind of shaped blackness. And advertising says so much about hope, our hopes and wishes at a specific moment in time. And this one I say is really fascinating because it's a sign of a time. It's an ad from 1977 that couldn't have existed in 1967. It's of a white man looking longingly at a black man's dark meat. And it's partially because of what was going on in popular culture with the blaxploitation movie era and all these images of kind of these super badass black men and their kind of white hosts, and kind of thinking about this kind of myth of the big black penis that kind of grew out of various stereotypes. But this is an ad from 1979. And it's like you see when black people are finally starting to really make it into middle class. And I say this one just happens to be black, and you see that where race isn't a factor, you see gender roles fall into place. So the men play as the women watch. And then on the left, the woman is being told to like feed this guy a burger. But if you look at his right hand, he's got his own burger down there. So, somehow I can imagine the photographer saying like, oh, you need something to do, feed him. And so the project is really interesting in the timeline, and this is from 2001. I call this, and I renamed them all. This is Once Upon a Time in America, There Were No Slaves. And that's because this is actually a Chevy ad, and it talked about kind of Black History Month. And I realized I was looking at through this timeline and I recognized that someone was missing between the African chief and the soldier. And you can't really sell with the heartbeat of America, with this beat up, bloody slave in the midst of it. And so, so think about these issues. One of the more recent projects I've done. So that project, the entire unbranded series, and so there's 82 images in it, and the entire series is up at PS1 MoMA as part of the Greater New York show up until October 18th, and then but half of it is up at the Brooklyn Museum and until March. So if you ever get to New York, maybe you can see some of these images in person. But another project I was doing is called Rebranded, and I was thinking about now that it's not politically correct to show black people in a certain light, there's a whole host of other people that you can kind of make fun of in quite a similar way. And now that it's not us in it, it's not kind of our issue. So this is an ad from 1939 and an ad from 2005. and I call it Now That's Funny. And so I'm really looking at these kind of juxtapositions between that kind of the coon images in 30s and 40s of African American, and then characters of other ethnicities in the current moment. And this one is the most striking for me, of this cotton picker in 1940 and a 2008 ad for a fair trade tea leaf company. And it's really fascinating because it's almost identical in how we feel like, someone that there's someone somewhere who's really happy to be doing our dirty work, that like under the hot sun with a basket strapped to her head, and like because she's earning a couple extra dollars a day doing this back-breaking labor, she's somehow happy to be doing that rather than spending time making food for herself and hanging out with her, or raising her own children. So that series is still in progress. But another project I did, and thinking about ephemera, I talk about my work as I see myself as a visual culture archaeologist. Somebody's phone is ringing. Is it Skype? And so thinking about myself as a visual culture archaeologist, and what I'm going to do, it's 12:48, and so I'm going to just talk to 12 o'clock, and maybe those of you who can stay to 1 o'clock, those of you guys can stay with questions, we can do that then. But just so I can just kind of show you a few more recent projects. But this is a project called Black is Beautiful, and I was really interested in ephemera as a way to tell kind of stories. And my mother, her second most recent book is called Posing Beauty, and in it she talks about, especially around the turn of the 20th century, it was still very political for someone to say that they were black and beautiful. In a sense, America saw that still as an oxymoron, and that a lot of these publications, like The Crisis, but also Ebony and Jet magazine, kind of part of their mission was to kind of represent black people in a new light as beautiful. And one of the things was these pinups, which we can talk about very differently in the current sense with kind of what's happened in women's representation movements since then. But it's really interesting to me to look at kind of this kind of development of beauty, or this representation of beauty, and especially in the 50s when this magazine started, where most of the representations of beauty were these really light-skinned women, and most of them had straight hair. And then you look into like around 1970, you see kind of different body types and different complexions starting to kind of bleed into the notion of beauty. And then in the 80s, the bodies become somewhat more athletic, and in the present sense, you could say that some people say that they've become more prosthetic. And so it's really kind of this interesting timeline. And I think about kind of these beauties of the week. It's fascinating because many people, most of us in this room, were born one of these weeks, and there was wars happened and started one of these weeks. The civil rights movement kind of caught its stride in one of these weeks, and the women's liberation movements caught its stride in one of these weeks, and all of these things were kind of chronicled in a sense in these pictures concurrently. And I found that kind of this fascinating kind of representation of history. But also recently I got to have an exhibition in Toronto where I got to put images on billboards, and I can't talk about the images so much, but it was really fascinating to kind of get to actually put the work out in large number in the public realm and see or notice if there was any interpretation. But it's interesting to like put images back, especially media images, back in the public that aren't selling anything. And one of the series I was doing is called Fair Warning, where I was looking at cigarette ads and the kind of the fashion and the beauty in them, and removing the cigarettes, and again looking at kind of what's really being sold. And I would use text from other cigarette ads and kind of make a combination. And there was this thing that when you're marketing to the poorest community, that that especially in the 80s, you start to see how much fashion and class and elegance was something sold as part of the product. And one of the things this is one of the things that made Iman famous. But I was really fascinated with like the gesture, and like who holds a cigarette that way, And it's like I call these look natural, because they're these women in these kind of really awkward positions that you're supposed to be enjoying the cigarette in.